Pregnant again? How utterly disappointing. Mara's sharp words shattered the heavy silence at the dining table. My stomach sank as I slowly lifted my gaze from my plate, meeting her sneering expression. Beside me, Evan shifted awkwardly in his seat but, as usual, said nothing. Mara's voice, laced with venom, sliced through the air again. Another daughter, I assume. When are you going to give my son the heir he deserves? Her words hit me like a blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. What should have been a joyful dinner to celebrate my pregnancy had turned into yet another stage for Mara's humiliation. Mother, please, Evan finally muttered, his voice barely audible. But Mara dismissed him with a sharp wave. Don't mother me. You're as pathetically spineless as your father was. If you don't take control of your wife, she'll keep bringing these useless female placeholders into this family. My chest tightened as tears stung my eyes. Summoning what little strength I had, I finally spoke. Zoe is not a placeholder. She's our daughter. And this pregnancy is still early. We don't know the baby's gender yet. Mara scoffed, rolling her eyes with disdain. Spare me the excuses. With your abysmal track record, it's bound to be another girl. You're nothing more than a failure of a broodmare. Her cold, biting words cut deep. I glanced at Evan, his head bowed under his mother's scorn. The heat of humiliation and anger burned within me, but I knew any attempt to defend myself would be wasted. I need some air, I choked out, pushing back from the table. I stumbled toward the back patio, needing to escape before I completely broke down. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, and I gulped it in, trying to steady my racing heart. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I struggled to comprehend how someone could be so relentlessly hateful. Footsteps behind me made me tense, bracing myself for another verbal onslaught. I turned, but it was Evan. His face was etched with guilt and sorrow as he reached for my hand. Lena, I'm so sorry. She was out of line, he said softly. You and the kids mean everything to me. Don't let her words get to you. I pulled my hand back, my frustration bubbling over. But I did listen, Evan. I've been listening to her cruel words for 8 years. Against me. Against Zoe. When are you finally going to stand up to her? His eyes widened in surprise, then dropped to the ground. Why, you know how she is, he stammered. She'll never change. Something shifted in me then. His weak response revealed a painful truth I had been trying to ignore. For the first time, I saw Evan's inability or unwillingness to stand up to his mother for what it truly was. As I looked at him, his slumped shoulders and helpless expression, it became painfully clear. This cycle of abuse and neglect would never end. Mara's grip on him was unyielding, and I would always bear the brunt of her bitterness. With a heavy heart, I turned back toward the house, leaving Evan standing alone with his hollow apologies. Inside, a growing sense of dread gnawed at me. I could feel the cracks forming in the foundation of my marriage. What I didn't realize in that moment was just how much worse things would become, and how this night would set off a chain of events that would change everything. The tension in the room was almost suffocating as Mara smoothed her silk blouse, a smug smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Lena, dear, she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I have some news that might shake things up a bit. I narrowed my eyes at her from across the kitchen counter, already dreading whatever scheme she had concocted. What are you talking about? I asked cautiously. Well, she said, her tone shifting to one of mock sympathy, you know how deeply concerned I've been about securing a proper heir for my son. A daughter is lovely, of course, but not suitable for carrying on the family legacy. Her words sent a fresh wave of anger rolling through me, but I forced myself to stay silent. After the explosive argument during our last dinner, I knew protesting was pointless against her twisted logic. Mara leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malice. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands to address this little issue. I introduced Evan to a wonderful young woman. Her name is Sienna, fertile, devoted, and perfectly capable of providing him with the son he deserves. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. But the satisfaction on her face confirmed this nightmare was real. You brought another woman into our marriage to have a child with my husband? My voice shook with disbelief and fury. Mara dismissed me with a wave of her hand, rolling her eyes. Oh, don't be so dramatic. I'm simply ensuring my son's future. Clearly, you've proven yourself incapable of fulfilling that role. Her cold, calculated words hit me like a physical blow. How could anyone be so cruel, so devoid of empathy? You manipulative, heartless witch. I screamed, unable to contain the fury boiling inside me. Does Evan even know about this disgusting scheme? Mara's smug expression didn't falter. Instead, she smiled wider. Why don't you ask him yourself? Dear, she said, tilting her head toward the doorway. I turned just in time to see Evan walk into the room, flanked by a slender, overly made-up woman I didn't recognize, Sienna. Her smug, self-assured expression made my stomach churn. Evan's guilty, downcast eyes said everything. You went along with this? Your own mother brought another woman into our marriage. And you let it happen? My voice cracked as I felt the ground beneath me give way. Evan shifted uncomfortably, but finally spoke. Lena, we discussed how important it is to carry on the family line. His words were hollow, almost rehearsed. I could feel the betrayal in every syllable. So, you're just going to let your mother bring in some cheap replacement to do her bidding? I shouted, my voice rising with unfiltered rage. Sienna raised an eyebrow, pretending to look offended, while Mara smirked triumphantly. Evan's gaze finally met mine, but it was cold, detached. This is for the greater good, Lena, he said firmly. My responsibility as a man. If you had fulfilled your duties as a wife, we wouldn't have had to resort to this. His words struck me harder than any blow could. I stood there, stunned, as the reality of his betrayal fully sank in. Mara let out a chuckle, clearly enjoying every second of my torment. Oh, don't take it so hard, dear. Once Sienna gives us the heir we need, you can focus on raising my granddaughter. That way, you won't feel completely useless. Her dismissive tone and condescending smile pushed me past the breaking point. Blinded by rage, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase, and hurled it with all my strength. The vase smashed into Mara's face, the shattering ceramic cutting deep as she screamed and crumpled to the floor, clutching her bloodied face. Sienna shrieked in terror, scrambling to get away from the chaos. Breathing heavily, I turned to Evan, who stood frozen, his face pale with shock and fear. In that moment, I knew there was no going back. My marriage was nothing but ashes, destroyed by Mara's manipulation and Evan's betrayal. This was no longer a family, it was a battlefield, and I was done being the victim. All that remained now was vengeance. The silence was deafening, broken only by Mara's labored breaths as she lay crumpled on the kitchen floor, her cries of pain finally subsiding. My fists clenched tightly at my sides as I stared down at her, my anger burning brighter than ever. Evan stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and fear, while Sienna hovered nearby, pale and visibly shaken by the chaos, yet still holding onto her role in this vile betrayal. You're insane. Mara's trembling voice finally cut through the tension, dripping with fury and indignation. I'll have you arrested for this. Assaulting me in my own home. Your home? I spat, my voice sharp and cutting. This is my home. The one I built with my husband. The same husband you're trying to manipulate into fathering a child with your hand-picked replacement, like some kind of deranged, controlling monster. Mara opened her mouth to retort, but I silenced her with a raised hand. Don't. Just don't. I heard every disgusting word. You brought another woman into our marriage, plotting to cuckold your own son. And you, I said, turning my glare to Evan. You went along with it. You stood by while she schemed to destroy everything we built together, ready to do her bidding without a second thought. Evan flinched under my words, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a defense. Lena, don't, I snapped, cutting him off. Did you honestly think I wouldn't find out? That I'd just stand by, oblivious, while you went behind my back to father a child with this woman? Before Evan could respond, Sienna's voice rang out, sharp and defensive. I am not some side piece. Your husband came on to me. I rounded on her, my lips curling into a cold smile. Oh, did he? And when you decided to throw yourself at a married man, did you give even a moment's thought to the family you were helping to destroy? Sienna's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her bravado cracked under the weight of the truth she couldn't deny. Shaking my head, I turned back to Evan, the fury in my voice rising. I gave you everything, Evan. A beautiful daughter, a loving home, a life people dream of. And you were ready to throw it all away just to satisfy your mother's sick obsession with producing an heir. Behind me, Mara stirred, her bloodied face swelling grotesquely from the vase's impact. You've no one to blame but yourself, she snarled, her voice a venomous rasp. You've failed as a wife. Enough. I slammed my hand onto the counter with a force that made everyone jump. My voice reverberated through the room, filled with all the pent-up rage and betrayal I'd carried for years. If producing a son is all that matters to you, then fine. Evan can have it. Take your mother, your new fling, and your pathetic quest for an heir, and get out of my life. I marched to the small desk in the corner, grabbed a pen and some papers, and thrust them toward Evan. Separation agreement.
Sign it.
You're free to do whatever you want with your mother's approval and your new companion. Evan stared at the papers, his face a mixture of shock and resignation. For a long moment, the room hung in silence, broken only by Mara's groans and Sienna's nervous fidgeting. Finally, with a trembling hand, Evan took the pen and scrawled his name across the papers. Each stroke felt like a dagger slicing through what little was left of our marriage. I snatched the signed documents from his hand, meeting his gaze one last time. His eyes were filled with a strange mixture of guilt and relief, as if he knew this was what his mother had wanted all along. Without another word, I turned on my heel and headed upstairs, clutching the papers that symbolized the end of my world. As I closed the door behind me, I wondered how I would ever rebuild from the wreckage Mara and Evan had left in their wake. The days that followed were a blur of numbness and disbelief. Evan and his mother had stormed out of the house after our explosive confrontation, taking Sienna with them. Their departure left behind an oppressive silence that swallowed the once lively home. I moved through the days like a ghost, my mind unable to fully grasp the devastating collapse of my marriage. I knew deep down that signing the separation papers was the only option after Evan's unforgivable betrayal, yet the weight of the loss threatened to consume me completely.
Zoe.
Our bright and curious 8-year-old daughter seemed to sense the tension in the air despite my best efforts to shield her from the turmoil. She had become quieter, her usual energy replaced by a hesitant clinginess that broke my heart even more. "Mommy, where did Daddy go?" she asked one evening, her small voice cutting through the heavy silence as we picked at our dinner. I froze, unprepared for the innocent question. My mind raced with how much of the truth I could, or should, share. A part of me wanted to unleash the ugly reality that her father had abandoned us to satisfy his mother's twisted obsession with a male heir. But I couldn't bear to strip away her innocence like that. "Daddy had to go away for a little while, sweetheart," I said carefully, forcing a steady tone. "It's work-related." Zoe frowned, her big, empathetic eyes searching mine for answers. "Are you sad, Mommy? Did you and Daddy have a fight?" "Something like that, baby," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "But it's going to be okay. I promise." The words tasted bitter, a lie I could barely convince myself to believe. At that moment, I couldn't see how anything could ever be okay again. A sharp knock at the front door jolted me from my thoughts, making both of us jump. Zoe's eyes lit up with cautious hope. "Is that Daddy?" she asked eagerly. "Stay here, sweetie," I said gently, rising from my chair with an uneasy feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. When I opened the door, it wasn't Evan. Instead, a man in an impeccably tailored suit stood before me, holding a crisp folder. His expression was cold and businesslike. "Mrs. Reading?" he asked curtly. "Yes," I replied, my voice wary. "I'm Mr. Collins, an associate of your husband's," he said without preamble, holding out the folder. "These documents have been prepared for your review and signature." I hesitated before taking the folder, dread washing over me like a tidal wave. The weight of the stack in my hands felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained the final nail in the coffin of my life, as I knew it. As I thumbed through the dense legal text, certain phrases leapt out at me like cruel taunts: petition for dissolution of marriage, rendered the covenant irreparably broken, division of assets favoring the male issue-bearing party. The words blurred on the page as realization struck like a physical blow. This wasn't just a divorce agreement, it was an outright assault. Evan and his mother were using their wealth and influence to take everything from me: my home, my life, and even my child, all in the name of their deranged obsession with producing a male heir. The room seemed to spin as I clutched the papers, the enormity of their betrayal sinking in. This wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was a declaration of war. "You have 48 hours to review and sign these terms, Mrs. Reading," Mr. Collins said coldly, his tone devoid of empathy. "After that, my client will pursue more aggressive legal action if you do not comply." The veiled threat in his words was unmistakable, sharp and toxic like poison. Memories of Mara's ruthless nature flashed through my mind: the chaos, the violence, the unrelenting obsession with ensuring the family line continued at any cost. Evan, weak and spineless, had clearly decided to align himself fully with his mother's malicious crusade. I realized then that they were prepared to do whatever it took to erase me entirely, punishing me for the supposed crime of giving him a daughter instead of the precious son they so desperately wanted. A cold, hollow resolve settled over me. The last remnants of hope in my shattered marriage crumbled into dust. There would be no tears, no desperate bargaining. I had nothing left but the fierce determination to protect my daughter, Zoe. From the next room, she watched me with wide, confused eyes, her innocent gaze piercing through my broken heart. She was my reason, my anchor. I wouldn't let them take her. I turned to Mr. Collins, my voice steady and unyielding. "Tell your client that after 48 hours, he'll hear from my attorney," I said, my words as sharp as steel. "And you can let him know that there's no way in hell I'm letting him take my daughter." Without waiting for response, I slammed the door in his face. Then I turned, pulling Zoe into my arms. Her small frame felt like the only solid thing in a sea of chaos. No matter how hard Evan and Mara tried to destroy me, I would fight. For Zoe's sake. I would survive, and I would make them pay for everything they had done. The next 2 days passed in a blur of grim focus. Time was short, and I knew Evan and Mara would stop at nothing to strip me of everything that mattered. My first step was hiring the best divorce attorney I could find. Caroline Weston had a reputation for taking down powerful men who thought their money and influence made them untouchable. "This is one of the most outrageous examples of alienation of affection I've ever seen," Caroline said with icy fury after I explained the sordid details. "Don't worry. We're going to destroy this man and his mother in court." Her confidence lit a spark of hope in me. Maybe, just maybe, I could come through this nightmare with my daughter and some dignity intact. Next, I started gathering evidence. I combed through financial records and uncovered a crucial piece of leverage. Evan's company had been funneling money into an offshore account for years. Tax evasion, embezzlement, the kind of information that could bring his world crashing down if exposed. It was exactly what I needed to tip the scales in my favor. Finally, I made arrangements for Zoe to stay temporarily with my sister Nina, who lived 2 states away. Nina, an elementary school teacher with a kind heart, was the perfect person to care for my little girl while I braced myself for the battle ahead. When the 48-hour deadline arrived, I was ready. Or, as ready as I could be. Mr. Collins arrived right on time, exuding his usual air of detached superiority. "I trust you've had sufficient time to review the agreement and come to a reasonable decision," he said with his characteristic flatness. Without a word, I slid a stack of papers across the table. But it wasn't the agreement Evan and his lawyer had given me. These documents bore Caroline Weston's signature, a completely reworked divorce settlement, designed to hold Evan accountable for his actions. Collins's brows furrowed as he scanned the unfamiliar terms. His expression darkened. "This is not the agreement we provided," he said, his tone stiff. "My client will need to review these changes." "These are the terms," I said coolly, my voice steady with resolve. "I won't be bullied or coerced. Every act of betrayal, every single lie, has consequences. If Evan and his mother can't accept that, they'll find out just how far I'm willing to go." Collins blinked, momentarily caught off guard by my conviction. I didn't flinch. This wasn't just about ending a marriage, it was about taking back my power. I slid a thick stack of documents across the table, my eyes fixed on Mr. Collins as he picked them up, his expression betraying a flicker of unease. The weight of what he held in his hands was undeniable. "My client's illegal financial dealings have been thoroughly documented by expert forensic accountants," I said, my voice steady, but laced with a quiet fury. "If there's any further attempt to rob me of my rightful claims, or to strip me of custody of my daughter, these records will be made public." The silence that followed was palpable, the threat hanging heavily in the air. Evan's deep insecurities about his business reputation were well known to me, and his mother's relentless exploitation of those weaknesses had been a cornerstone of her manipulations for years. Now, that same leverage was mine to wield. Collins's face remained carefully neutral, but the faint clench of his jaw betrayed the effort it took to maintain his composure. "I'll present this counteroffer to Mr. Reading," he said tightly. "Provided, of course, that this documentation remains confidential." "See that you do," I replied coolly, "because if you don't, I'll ensure every damning detail sees the light of day." With a curt nod, Collins gathered the documents and left, clearly unsettled by the turn of events. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope that I could claw back some semblance of control and protect the life I had built for Zoe and me. I turned to find my daughter watching me with wide, anxious eyes. Gathering her into my arms, I held her tightly, feeling the weight of her trust in me. "Mommy, what's going on?" "I want Daddy to come home," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I know, sweetheart," I whispered, stroking her hair as my heart ached. "But for now, you're going to stay with Aunt Nina, okay?"
"Just for a little while."
"It's important to keep you safe." Zoe nodded reluctantly, sensing the seriousness of my tone. As I held her close, I silently vowed to shield her from the storm that was brewing, even if it meant facing Evan and Mara's wrath head-on. The divorce battle erupted with a ferocity I hadn't anticipated. Spurned by my refusal to capitulate, Evan and Mara launched an all-out legal assault, aiming to crush me under the weight of their wealth and influence. But Caroline Weston, my attorney, was more than up to the challenge. With her sharp mind and unrelenting determination, she matched their aggression blow for blow. Mara escalated the conflict by starting a public smear campaign, painting me as an unfit mother and vindictive spouse. But we struck back just as hard, revealing the details of her sickening scheme to manipulate her own son into producing a male heir. The battle was brutal and exhausting, but I refused to back down. My resolve to protect Zoe kept me going, even as the war drained me emotionally and financially. After 6 long, excruciating months, the relentless fighting finally pushed Evan's side to the brink. Cooler heads prevailed, and they proposed a negotiated settlement. The toxic spectacle of Mara's actions, combined with the mounting pressure from Evan's crumbling business empire, left them with little choice. The day of the final negotiation arrived, and the tension in the sterile conference room was suffocating. Evan entered first, his posture stiff, but his eyes hollow from months of turmoil. Mara followed, her face still marked by faint scars from our previous confrontation, her expression twisted into a familiar sneer. Seeing her wounded pride brought me a small, fleeting sense of satisfaction. There were no pleasantries exchanged. We got straight to business. My client is prepared to agree to an equitable division of assets, Caroline said firmly, her tone sharp and unyielding. Provided there's a permanent renunciation of custodial claims over the minor child. Mara's glare burned into me, her fury palpable. Giving up any claim to Zoe was a bitter pill for them to swallow. But it was a necessary condition for ensuring my daughter's safety and future. Caroline delivered the terms without flinching. Additionally, she continued, her voice as sharp as a blade, there will be binding assurances that the unconventional circumstances surrounding this marriage remain sealed. Any breach will carry severe legal consequences. Evan shifted uncomfortably at the mention of their sordid heir plot, while Mara's scowl deepened. Neither of them dared respond. Their lead counsel finally spoke, his voice stiff with resignation. While these terms are unusual, we are willing to accept them, provided all parties agree to indemnity from future claims. The room fell into a tense silence. Both sides knew how much damage further exposure could cause, not just to Evan's business, but to his freedom. They had no choice but to concede. Agreed, Caroline said smoothly, her shark-like grin barely concealed. The negotiations dragged on for hours, as every asset and investment was meticulously divided. By the end of it, both sides had been bled dry in one way or another. Evan and Mara retained their wealth, but the concessions they had to make left Mara seething with rage. She had lost her grip on both her son and Zoe, a devastating personal defeat. As I left the conference room, the weight of the battle lifted slightly from my shoulders. This wasn't victory. Not entirely, but it was enough. For Zoe's sake, it was enough. I'm not expecting congratulations, Caroline said quietly as the last of the paperwork was completed. This case has been nothing short of disturbing and infuriating. But you held your ground and ensured the best outcome for your daughter's future. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. After the grueling legal battle, there was no sense of triumph, just the cold relief of having survived. As I signed the final document, I looked across the table at Mara one last time. Her face was twisted with rage, the scars from our earlier confrontation faintly visible. Don't ever come near me or my daughter again, you vile, scheming. I stopped short, realizing I didn't even have the energy to finish the insult. Her sputtering outrage barely registered as I stood, walked out of the room, and began the process of rebuilding what remained of my life. There was still one more thread to cut, though, and I knew exactly how to sever Mara's last illusions with precision and finality. With the divorce finalized and my financial future secured, my focus turned to the most important thing, Zoe. For months, she had been shuttled between relatives, shielded from the chaos of the legal war raging between her parents. The thought of her confusion and hurt haunted me every night. When Nina brought her home, Zoe ran straight into my arms, trembling with soft, broken sobs. My heart shattered all over again as she clung to me. I missed you so much, Mommy, she cried. I was so scared. I stroked her hair and held her tightly, fighting back tears. I missed you too, baby, more than anything. But it's okay now. You're safe, and we're going to be just fine. She pulled back, her innocent face shadowed with questions she was too young to fully voice. Is Daddy ever coming home? A lump rose in my throat as I looked into her wide, curious eyes so much like Evan's. I couldn't lie to her, but I couldn't shatter her trust completely, either. Daddy can't live with us anymore, I said gently. He made choices that weren't right for our family. Her brow furrowed, the words puzzling her. Did he do something bad? In a way, yes, I admitted quietly, pulling her close again. But you don't need to worry about that. What matters is that you and I are here together, and we're going to make everything better. She nodded slowly, her small arms tightening around me. In that moment, I promised myself I would do everything in my power to protect her innocence and happiness. Over the weeks that followed, Zoe and I began piecing our lives back together. Using the settlement from the divorce, I secured a new beginning, a cozy rental home far removed from the toxic memories of Evan and Mara. Zoe started a new school, and I began rebuilding my career in marketing communications. Little by little, the light returned to her eyes. her laughter slowly bubbling back into our lives as we found a new rhythm. The only disruption came in the form of an unexpected message from Sienna, Evan's former mistress, the woman Mara had chosen to secure the heir. "Your sorry excuse for a husband came crawling back to me," the message read. "But after seeing his true colors and dealing with that psychotic mother of his, I wanted no part of their dysfunctional freak show." Attached were details of the exorbitant settlement Sienna had wrung out of Evan in exchange for her silence and disappearance. She made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with any of us again. Strangely, I didn't feel anger, only pity. Sienna had been nothing more than a pawn in Mara's twisted schemes, discarded the moment she ceased to be useful. Her words stung far more for Evan and Mara than they ever could for me, a final condemnation of their obsessive, failed plan. It felt like the last embers of their toxic drama had burned out, leaving me free to focus entirely on Zoe. While occasional attempts from Mara's camp surfaced, desperate, grotesque outbursts lamenting her loss of control, I systematically shut them down, blocking her from every avenue of contact. For Zoe's sake, I maintained peace and stability, refusing to let the darkness of Evan and Mara's world touch her again. This was our new life, and it was one I would guard fiercely. A few months after the settlement was finalized, I received an unexpected and awkward text from Evan. His words stumbled over themselves, an attempt to express regret that only came across as hollow and desperate. "I know I have no right to darken your life any longer. The wreckage left behind is entirely my shame to bear. But I hope one day Zoe will understand that despite everything, I did love her with all my heart." The message was a faint echo of a man searching for absolution, for a thread of validation to cling to. But I didn't respond. My focus was entirely on the life I had rebuilt with Zoe, a life centered on peace, love, and freedom from the poison of Evan's cowardice and Mara's manipulations. His plea for sympathy couldn't touch me anymore, not after the pain he had caused. And certainly not after the weight of his decisions left him to grapple with his guilt, utterly alone. The years passed with surprising calm as I raised Zoe. Our new life wasn't without its challenges, but they paled in comparison to the relentless toxicity that had defined my marriage. As Zoe grew, she blossomed into a self-assured, intelligent young woman. I ensured she understood the basic truths of our family's past, not to foster bitterness, but so she could see the flaws in the twisted values that had driven her father and grandmother. Zoe never showed anger toward them, only a quiet pity that reflected her wisdom beyond her years. "I'm just glad I had you, Mom," she told me once. "You're the one who always understood what really matters. Family, not bloodlines." Her words filled me with both pride and sorrow. I was proud of the strength and insight she had developed, but I mourned the innocence she had lost too soon. Still, I found comfort in knowing I had shielded her from the worst of their viciousness. Then, one day, a letter arrived, a seismic aftershock that would shatter even the calm we had worked so hard to achieve. At first, it seemed unremarkable, a certified envelope, its official appearance mundane. But when I saw the return address, a maximum security prison, my breath caught. My hands trembled as I tore it open. The message inside was cold and impersonal. "Mrs. Reading, we regret to inform you that your former husband, Evan Reading, has been incarcerated on charges of corporate racketeering, embezzlement, and tax evasion. His sentence is expected to span more than a decade." The rest of the letter blurred as the words sank in. Evan's world had finally crumbled under the weight of his own corruption. The evidence I had unearthed years ago during our divorce, the leverage I had kept hidden, had become his undoing. Though I hadn't intended for it to come to this. The authorities had clearly dug deeper, uncovering the full extent of his crimes. A sick twist of satisfaction surged through me, only to sour as it quickly gave way to something heavier: remorse, empathy, feelings I didn't want to acknowledge for the man who had destroyed our family. Yet they were there, undeniable and unwelcome. No matter how much Evan deserved the punishment, no matter how justified his downfall, I couldn't ignore the ripple effects. Mara's entire life, built around her obsession with the family's legacy and her desperate pursuit of a male heir, was now reduced to ashes. With Evan behind bars, her empire of manipulation and control had crumbled completely. She would be utterly alone, her scheming reduced to nothing but a cruel irony. I tried to suppress the small thread of compassion growing inside me, reminding myself of Mara's relentless cruelty and how eagerly she had sought to obliterate me and my daughter. Yet the ghost of the hopeful young bride I had once been lingered, whispering the bitter truth. Mara's undoing had been her own creation. Her twisted worldview, her relentless drive for control, had doomed her and Evan long before this final collapse. In the end, her own obsession had destroyed everything she held dear. The ripple effects of Evan's incarceration were impossible to predict. What would happen to the real estate empire he had worked so hard to build, now that its foundation was mired in scandal? And more importantly, how might this impact Zoe? As I reread the letter, searching for any clues about what came next, the front door opened and Zoe walked in. Now a young woman thriving in college, she exuded confidence and independence. But when her eyes met mine, the concern was immediate. Mom, did you hear from? She stopped mid-sentence, her expression shifting as she noticed my pale, shaken demeanor. Mom, what's wrong? Without a word, I handed her the letter. I watched as her eyes darted across the page, her brows lifting in shock as the reality of its contents settled in. Oh my God, Dad's in prison. Her voice wavered, the hurt and disbelief evident despite our years of distance from Evan. I stepped closer, pulling her into an embrace as I stroked her hair, just as I had done when she was a child. I know, sweetheart. It's a lot to take in, I said softly. She held onto me tightly, her thoughts clearly racing. I could feel the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. After a long moment, she pulled back, her expression resolute and her voice steady. This doesn't change anything for us, Mom. His choices, his crimes, that's all on him. We've built something better. Something separate from his mistakes and grandmother's madness. Zoe took my hands in hers, her warm smile radiating strength and hope. Maybe this is it, the end of everything they've cast over us. A fresh start. We don't need them or their shadows looming over our lives anymore. Her words filled me with pride and love, the kind that surged from the depths of my soul. She was right. Even as Evan's world imploded and Mara's legacy disintegrated, Zoe and I stood strong, unbroken. Pulling her close once more, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The chains of that toxic family history were falling away, leaving us free. Mara and Evan had gambled everything on lies, manipulation, and power, but it was their obsession that had buried them. In their downfall, I had triumphed, not through revenge, but through resilience. My bond with Zoe, forged in love and trust, had proven unshakable in the face of their destruction. As their kingdom crumbled into dust, the words I had once hurled at Mara came back to me, more true now than ever before. Never set foot near me or my daughter again. This time, it's final.